Are you too busy, too stressed out, unhealthy? Then this is the place for you. Welcome to Balanced Living for Busy Professionals, where we help you create wellness and balance with a holistic approach that will work for you, even with the busiest of schedules, so you can live the life you want. And now, here's your host, Diane Randall.
Hello and welcome back to Balanced Living for Busy Professionals. Today's episode is all about overcoming food obsession and binging. When preparing for this show, it brought forward a memory. I thought about a time in my life when I was obsessed with food, always feeling that I could never get enough. I was never satisfied and I binged often. I felt as if my brain had been hijacked and I had no control, and I spent many years trying to figure out how I could get control. So I am just excited that my guest, Dr. Glenn Livingston, is here to give you information on how you can never binge again. His mission is to help as many binge eaters as possible. And he's here today on Balanced Living for Busy Professionals to share his own journey out of obesity and food prison to a normal, healthy weight and a much more lighthearted relationship with food. And he'll talk about his specific technique for isolating and disempowering your fat-thinking self. My guest is Dr. Glenn Livingston, PH.D. He is a veteran psychologist who was disillusioned by what traditional psychology had to offer overweight or food-obsessed individuals. Dr. Livingston spent several decades researching the nature of binging and overeating for his own study that he funded himself with over 40,000 participants. He is the author of Never Binge Again, Stop Overeating and Binge Eating, and Reprogram Yourself to Think Like a Permanently Thin Person on the food plan of your choice. Dr. Livingston, welcome.
Well, thanks, Diane. I'm really looking forward to this interview. Looking forward to talking to you.
I have been looking forward to talking to you for months. It seems like months. I'm sure it's just been a short amount of time. You're also the author of the book, Never Binge Again, Stop Overeating and Binge Eating, and Reprogram Yourself to Think Like a Permanently Thin Person.
I am the author of that book.
You sure are.
That's the guy that looks at me in the mirror.
So I want you to tell us what that journey was like for you from being obese to a permanently thin person.
Well, I've got so much to say based on that introduction. Sometimes people introduce me with all of those credentials, and I wonder who that guy is. I suffered, I think, more than anybody else with food. I was obsessed with food more than anybody else that I know, and including during a period when I originally did not see patients for the purpose of helping them with their overeating. I was a couples and family therapist. I was as obsessed as anyone else with food. And I think there are very good reasons in our culture why people become obsessed with food. I mean, originally, that was our job, to be obsessed with food. If you think about us on the savannah, many millions of years ago, we had to find our next meal all the time. We couldn't go down to Starbucks and get a latte or, McDonald's and get a supersized whatever. We had to hunt and gather, and that was our job. So our brains are kind of wired to be obsessed. And then on top of it, our culture has a number of messages and products which really push those evolutionary buttons. We've got the food industry, which crams as many calories into the smallest spaces possible and then makes it look as attractive and healthy, makes it look attractive and healthy with packaging and, spends billions of dollars on advertising to drive the message home. So it's almost irresistible. And then on the other side, the treatment industry says you really can't resist. You can only abstain one day at a time. And, when you kind of take that wallop, that double wallop, it's a wonder that any of us aren't obsessed. It's a wonder that any of us can go on with our day without thinking about the next meal and, wondering what next supersized jumbo jumbo they're going to be able to put in their face. So with that said, I'm going to tell you my story in a second, but I just want to warn people that I'm not really speaking as a psychologist today. I am a psychologist, But the end point that I arrived at is really far from academic or psychological in as much as my profession would think. And so I, actually kind of bill myself more as a coach and an educator than a psychologist in this venue, because it's fairly simplistic what the resulting solution was, despite all of the tremendous pain and suffering that I and so many other people go through in trying to find a solution. Despite all the money and time I spent researching depthful, soulful solutions. So with that, why don't I tell you what my story was? Is that okay?
Yes, yes.
So I was what you would call an exercise bulimic, which meant that I probably would have put my finger down my throat if it didn't gross me out so much. And my way of purging instead was with a tremendous amount of exercise. Sometimes I would do all the exercise in order to earn a really big binge. Other times I would do all the exercise to try to purge the really big binge. But either way, it really takes over your life. I was relatively thin through high school and college by exercising a lot and eating whatever I want to. If you followed me around and saw what I ate, you'd wonder that I actually survived college. Maybe like 6 black and white cookies a day and a bag of cheese doodles and maybe some pizza later on. And I kind of wonder how I got through that. But I didn't gain weight because I spent so much time exercising, and school was relatively easy for me. And, I had very small jobs and I managed to get by. When I got older and I took on responsibilities, when I started to have patients and, when I got married and I owned a business and I had to attend to everything, I didn't have the time to spend 3 hours exercising a day, nor really should I have been. And so I found that I started gaining weight relatively quickly because it was very, very difficult to stop eating. By then, I'd really developed a pattern where I almost didn't feel normal if I couldn't binge during the day. And, I'm a pretty smart person, and I was brought up in a family of psychologists by my parents are both psychologists and psychotherapists, and my uncle and my cousins and just about everybody in the family is in the profession. So I had access to some of the best resources you could imagine to try to solve the problem, but they couldn't. And, I actually watched them gain weight over time and seemed to be maybe not quite as obsessed with food as I was, but, really having difficulty shedding the pounds and eating normally. And, so there was something odd about the fact that we as psychologists, psychotherapists, and counselors, even though we really understood the relationship between food and emotional issues, which is part of what I studied later on, that we couldn't necessarily solve it. It's almost like having a really good X-ray, but not having the treatment to fix the broken bone once you figure out where it is.
Correct.
That's kind of what it was like.
Mm-hmm. And
so as I got progressively older, it was bothering me more and more, and it was taking up a really good part of my life. And it was difficult for me to sit with my patients sometimes without thinking about when the day was going to be over and I could eat a whole pizza. And I started to feel very guilty about that because my work has always been exceptionally important to me, and it's really part of my life's mission to be fully present for people when I, accept responsibility for working with them. And I really wanted to be my best, and I felt like, my God, I was really going to fail with these people if I couldn't overcome this. And I did a whole host of things to try to figure it out. I funded my own very detailed research study with 40,000 survey participants where we took some personality measures and informal personality measures, and we took an inventory of the things that they struggled with eating. In this study, there were a lot of very interesting findings, which I got a lot of publicity for. For example, I found that people who really gravitated towards chocolate and felt like they couldn't stop eating chocolate, when those people tended to be feeling unloved or lonely or isolated. And people who craved bagels and pasta and potatoes, they tended to be people who were under a lot of stress at work in particular, but also a lot of stress at home. And people who craved potato chips and kind of salty snacks, they tended to be more anxious. And I thought when I discovered that I'd really found something, because I figured that, okay, if someone tells me they can't stop eating chocolate, then I need to ask a little bit more about their, more personal relationships and try to help them solve some of the intimacy and loneliness difficulties in their life. And if I could do that, I figured that they would be able to stop overeating chocolate. But what happened instead was it was almost like there was something inside them that said, oh, I can wait until I figure out how not to feel so lonely before I have to stop eating chocolate. I'm going to have it more. And, the same things would happen with the pasta and carbohydrates and the, the salty snacks. And what I took away from that was that although there's an intense correlation between food cravings and emotional issues, the emotional issues, they don't necessarily cause the overeating. What we're going to have to do to overcome the overeating, what would be to figure out how to overcome that voice that said, it's almost like the little devil on your shoulder or something like that, that says, oh, you're so lonely, go ahead and have some chocolate, you'll feel better. And we were going to have to overcome that voice that said, until you figure out the loneliness, you're not going to be able to stop eating chocolate. And then I started listening more carefully, and I was exposed to, I did a lot of additional research into addiction. I actually went to Overeaters Anonymous for a while myself. And they told me I had a chronic progressive disease and I couldn't hope to abstain and it wasn't going to get better. And I had to work this really great program or I was going to, and they were all nice people. And I think some people get help there. But when I looked at the research, I saw that the 12-step programs weren't really any more effective than doing nothing at all. And that really bothered me. And I was eventually exposed to someone who takes a stand in the other direction and says that, no, the only way to quit an addiction is to really quit for good. It's not, his name was Jack Trimpey at Rational Recovery. And that concept really took hold for me, except he works a lot more with the black and white addictions like drugs and alcohol and smoking.
Is there a big difference though?
Well, there's a lot of similarity, but there is a big difference.
Okay.
And the big difference is that you can stop. There's no nutritional need for you to smoke. There's no nutritional need for you to do cocaine. There's no nutritional need for you to drink. You have to eat something no matter what all day long. And there are a lot of different food decisions that you need to make throughout the day. And so there was a lot of modification and experimentation that I had to do to figure out a system that was kind of based on this devil and angel on your shoulder, and learning to recognize that little voice, but would work in a more complex behavioral system like food. Because if you talk about alcohol, virtually everybody agrees that alcoholics should stop drinking. Virtually everybody agrees on that. If you talk about heroin, virtually everybody agrees that heroin addicts shouldn't use heroin. You talk about food, there are 42,000 different philosophies on how to eat, and nobody exactly agrees on the rules that you're supposed to have, and then, forget what's on television. I mean, because I saw one study where they said that there are more than 5,000 commercials a year that children are exposed to about food, and not one of them is for fruit or vegetables.
Right. And I call that the conditioning, the deconditioning and programming to eat.
Yes. Well, say a little bit more about that.
Well, in my experience, because I said early on, I was so addicted to sugar. I mean, it was crazy in food because I did go from one thought to the other. But I also feel through my experience and through my workshops is that when we watch these commercials, they subliminally put messages. We get this messaging that we want this creamy, delightful pizza or orange juice. We get this, what I call programming that suggests to us what we may want to eat. And sometimes our mouths may water. All of a sudden, I want something sweet. Or you just saw a Burger King commercial and now you want a burger. That's what I mean by the deep conditioning.
That is deep conditioning. And having spent time working in the food industry, which I'm a little ashamed of in some ways.
Well, I did too as a consultant, and I'm happy about that experience because that's how I've learned so much.
That's a very good reframe. Thank you, Diane. That's a good way to reframe it. But what I was going to say is, do you ever hear the expression, makeup and paint can make a woman what she ain't? It's kind of an expression from the 1920s.
No, but it's interesting.
Well, makeup and paint can make food what it ain't also.
Okay.
And if you were to look at what goes on before those commercials are shot, you would see people that are paid an awful lot of money to prop up the food and make it look more succulent and delicious. And they don't do it with natural food substances. You know, that there are artificial chemicals and paints and, you know, they can kind of pump air into them and, you know, and then things can be touched up afterwards. So when you're seeing that burger on the screen, that's not the same burger you're necessarily going to get when you go to the fast food restaurant.
Interesting.
Yeah.
I never knew that piece, what you're talking about right there. I just remember as a consultant at a food company on a certain day of the week, they would invite, and I was a consultant, but they would invite the employees over to come and do taste tests. And part of my role also was production, is to know what the ingredients of a particular food is, because I had to help the company basically track these items in the computer system. So that's why I had to know.
I see.
Yeah.
I see. Yeah. I'm in favor of commerce and a free market.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's really up to us as buyers to learn how to arm ourselves with the right information and resist some of these billion-dollar messages that are coming at us, you know, on a daily basis through that deep conditioning.
But how do we resist? Yeah.
Well, okay. So this is what I came to, and this is what solved my problem. And this is where I just have to warn you one more time that this is not going to really be Dr. Glenn talking. This is not going to sound like a fancy psychologist talking with all academic experience and, you know, all the corporate stuff that I've done. This is what I did. I'm almost a little embarrassed to say this, but I decided there was a pig inside me. And I decided that all I needed to do if I wanted to resist chocolate was I had to make a very concrete rule with no ambiguity whatsoever about chocolate. So maybe it would be, I will never eat chocolate again. Maybe I was and there's some people who are just so fed up with how beaten up they feel by chocolate that they would rather have it out of their life, and they'd rather just become a person who doesn't eat chocolate than someone who has it in moderation. I have no judgments, by the way, about people who want to have it in moderation. There's nothing I'm going to say that would dictate exactly what diet you eat. Mm-hmm. For me, one chocolate bar was never enough. I wanted to have 4, and then I wanted to have pizza afterwards, and muffins and lattes, and it just was part of a whole cycle, and I was really better off never having chocolate again. So I decided you had to come up with a very concrete rule, which there was no wiggle room for. So if 10 people followed me around all week and they knew that my rule was Glenn will never have chocolate again, then they would all agree at the end of the week whether I had chocolate again. If my rule had been, well, I will mostly avoid chocolate, I'm going to be a person who mostly avoids chocolate, at the end of that week, those 10 people wouldn't necessarily agree whether I avoided it or not, mostly, because mostly wasn't defined. And so I drew that very clear line in the sand. And I said, on one side of that line is pig slop, and only pigs eat pig slop. I'm not going to eat pig slop. This is why women sometimes don't like my philosophy because they think I'm calling them a pig, and I'm not. You can call this inner fat thinking self whatever you want. I know a woman calls it her inner slacker, and this procedure works equally well for women as it does for men. So on one side of the line is the pig's trough, and pig slop goes in the pig slough, and on the other side of the line is everything that I eat. On the other side of the line is also all of my goals and aspirations and dreams and best laid plans. And I started thinking in this very binary way. And whenever I would hear the pig talking to me to try to justify that I would have chocolate, I would say, well, chocolate is pig slop and I don't eat pig slop. And Diane, that was it.
That was it?
It was just a very simplistic thing because the way our brains are wired, if you can recognize the impulse, you've kind of jumped up into your higher brain where the neocortical functions can inhibit the lizard brain and the lower brain functions. And our lower brain functions are very related to survival needs. If you look at the way that the brain has developed over time, I'm sure a neurologist will tell me I'm making some mistakes here, but this is basically it. Initially, there was the lizard brain, and it was wired for immediate survival. So the lizard brain sees something, and it says, do I eat it? Do I kill it? Or do I mate with it? That's basically what the lizard brain does. Then there's the mammalian brain, which kind of layers on top of the lizard brain and says, I need to protect my tribe. I need to make these decisions about eating or mating or killing, but I can slow that down a little bit because I have to take into consideration, is this good for my tribe or not? And that's, believe it or not, where we began to have feelings of love and the need for social contact, and in their evolutionary tree, how that all came about. And then on top of those two is the neocortical brain, which is very capable of delaying action in order to accomplish higher level goals. So when we say, I want to lose 20 pounds, that I is living in the neocortex. That I, it's kind of, relying on the frontal lobe and other parts of the neocortex to inhibit the mammalian brain and inhibit the lizard brain so that the higher level goals come next. But now what happens is the survival brain is still, it's very primitive. And in the moment of impulse, there's often not time to access all of your higher level plans and all of the complex rules and decision making that you really want to be able to do in those moments. And that's why people always say, I don't know what happened to me. I had this plan on Monday morning, but then by Monday afternoon, I heard this little voice that said to do it, and I just went for it. I don't know how the heck that happened. But it turns out that if you can just insert a momentary pause, and what this technique does is it gives you that momentary pause. It makes the decision for you beforehand so that there's not really the possibility of confusion in the moment of impulse. And then it inserts the pause and you go, oh yeah, that's my lower brain talking, but that's not really what I want to accomplish. That's not really what I want to do. And when it comes to food, as long as you are otherwise taking care of your body, so this is one of the reasons that crash diets don't work very well, because the more of a caloric deficit that you start to run as compared to your true metabolic needs, the more that the lizard brain and mammalian brain are wired to become primary and make you be less discriminating in what you eat.
And we know, Dr. Glenn, that's many millions of Americans today. Let's just be honest about that. Not that I'm judging or blaming, but because of all the food and all the messaging, we have that lizard brain and no self-control.
And what's really going on here, you started out with the idea that the brain has been hijacked, and that really is what's going on. That the incredibly palatable, delicious looking, delicious tasting foods from industry really hijack the survival brain at the moment of impulse. And then if you add to that the incredibly busy and in some ways unnatural lives that we've adopted as opposed to how we evolved.
Yes.
Right, because we were not meant to sit in a room with four walls and look at a screen with electrons on it all day, right?
Right.
Yeah. So you kind of put that all together and you lose yourself in the mix. On Sunday morning, I was journaling and I had this goal and it made perfect sense to me and I was 100% committed to it and I was really happy about it because it just represents my aspirations and accomplishing what I want and feeling like I'm living in the super body that I really want to live in. But then life happens and it's like you lost yourself. And so what this crazy little technique does is it gives you something to remember, something really easy to remember. It makes the decisions beforehand for you so you're not busy scratching your head saying, well, what did I want to do with chocolate again? And am I allowed to? And it puts you back into your right brain, into your upper brain. I get very excited about these things. I'm sorry if I'm over talking.
Oh, no,
do you want to say something?
We really need to know. So I want you to tell someone that's listening right now, besides getting your book, what's the first thing they could do tomorrow to help turn things around with food?
I find the most success when people identify their single worst food problem. So maybe for me, it was chocolate. For me, it was chocolate. For other people, it's pizza. For some people, it's, pasta or cheese or nuts or whatever. But identify the single worst food problem. And then ask yourself, you kind of decide not to decide about this for the moment, but ask yourself, in the ideal scenario, how would you like to see yourself behaving around that food? Do you wish that you could never have it again? Do you want to impose some type of a conditional rule on it? So maybe you only have pretzels at Major League Baseball games. Sometimes the single worst problem is not something you need to eliminate, but something that you need to make yourself do every day. So, do you always want to make sure you drink 8 glasses of water every day? Or do you always want to have 6 servings of fruit and vegetables every day? And I would ask yourself to consider the variety of different ways that you might, in the ideal scenario, behave. If there was a rule that you knew you could follow 100%, what would it be? And you write down a couple of different ideas, and then take a piece of paper and look at those ideas. So let's say I was back in the days when I was figuring out what to do with chocolate, and my ideas might have been, one idea is to just give it up entirely. It turned out to be the one that worked for me. Another one might be that I'm allowed to do it 2 calendar days per week after an intense exercise of an hour or more, because, you rep up your metabolism, you process some of the drug-like effects of chocolate more easily. And another idea might be that I could only have it at social events. Take a piece of paper and put those 3 ideas at the top. And then ask yourself, what might your future look like in 1 year if you 100% complied with each of these 3 rules? You're going to have 3 different futures. What would it look like? When I do this with people, often in the first category, they'll say, well, I'll have lost my fear of diabetes, and I'll be living in a body that's 30 pounds lighter, and I'll be more present for my husband or my wife, and I'll be enjoying life more, and I'll sleep more soundly. And, and they really start to list some of the reasons why complying with that rule might really work for them. So then you look at the perceived future with regards to the second idea. And most people will find that if you kind of have listed the ideas in order of decreasing strictness, they'll find that the future for the second idea is a little worse than the first. It's still pretty good, but it's a little worse than the first. And as they get to the least strict rule, they'll usually find that the future is really not nearly as good. Sometimes it is. Now, if they do find that the least strict rule is as good or better, then it's pretty clear that you'll want to go for that least strict rule. Because the whole purpose of this is to maximize your freedom and enjoyment with food without sacrificing your health goals. So it's almost like if you're a city planner, you don't want to put up more stop signs and stoplights than you absolutely need to protect the population. What you're really looking for is a free flow of traffic. But, there are some intersections where you really do need a stoplight. There's some intersections you really do need a stop sign. So when you're comparing these potential futures, then after you've done that, you want to have a talk with your pig, and you want to give your pig its best chance to say why you shouldn't adopt any of these rules. And what I find after I've done that with people is that all the pig can say is, Oh, because it tastes so good. It's just so good. You can't live without that. You're going to starve. You're going to die. You can't do that. And what we've done then is really expose the pig for the kind of creature that it is.
Is that the fat thinking self?
Yes.
I wondered about that when I first heard that.
Yes, we've exposed our inner fat thinking selves for exactly what it is.
Okay, I love that. I love that.
And you've effected a separation between your fat thinking self and your thin thinking self. And once you've done that, it becomes kind of like almost like a computer program or an idea that just keeps growing inside of you. You can't get rid of that idea. Once you've had the experience that it's almost like there's two of you and there's this set of thoughts, but there's not really two of you inside, you're all the same person, but you're separating those thoughts and there's this set of thoughts that encourages you to break the rule and there's a set of thoughts that encourages you to keep to the rule. And once you start paying attention and separating them, that idea gets stronger and stronger and stronger. And it starts to kind of reorganize your thinking about food so that you have a much better capacity to follow whatever rule you want to follow. Not that anybody else tells you to follow, but whatever rule you want to follow.
Mm-hmm. Awesome information. So can you just talk a little bit about your book and tell the listeners how they can get a copy?
Well, as of today, it's free on Amazon, and the best way to get there is to go to neverbingeagain.com and click the book icon, or better yet, sign up for the reader bonuses. And in addition to the free book, you will get a set of food plan starter templates, so you can see the kind of templates that see how the food plans are actually developed. You get instructions for developing your own food plan. You'll get to hear a whole set of case studies. They're kind of like podcasts in and of themselves, where I take people through this process little by little. I'm not talking anywhere near as much, and you can hear how their thinking is changing as we're working through. There's one in particular where I helped a woman to give up popcorn, and she was just so excited when she realized that she didn't have to have popcorn anymore. And it's very powerful to hear that for yourself rather than just trying to do it based upon the description of the technique, because, well, I guess the devil is always in the details. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and what the book is, it was actually a journal originally. I like I said, I really struggled myself, and once I was exposed to this idea, I spent about 5 years journaling to myself and kind of having these talks with my inner pig. And I eventually learned that you mostly want to ignore it. You don't even have to talk to it. But in the book, I isolated the particular squeals. Whenever the pig talks, we call that pig squeal. Mm-hmm. I isolated the particular pig squeals that trip me up the most. And then once I started working with clients, I started to add the things that trip the clients up the most. And so it's kind of people say that it's a short, easy read. It's got over 100 reviews and 4.5 stars, and and it's free. So you really have nothing to lose.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, you've certainly given us a lot of wonderful information. I can't wait to download my copy so that I can read your book. If anyone's interested in Dr. Glenn's information, all of his website and links to the book and his templates will be in the show notes. Dr. Glenn, I want to thank you for coming on Balanced Living for Busy Professionals and sharing this life-changing information. And I want to also thank you for your mission to help the masses by giving this book electronically free.
Thank you, dear. Thank you, dear. It was a lot of fun.
Thank you for listening to Balanced Living for Busy Professionals. This podcast is sponsored by dianerandallconsults.com. If you like this show, the best way to support it is by leaving 5-star feedback on iTunes. And please, feel free to email your questions, comments, and suggestions to feedback@dianerandallconsults.com. Until next week, namaste.